As you know, T.Rex Arms wants to be the coolest, most advanced company working on the most cutting-edge military technology possible, which is why we are doing books now. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about books because this past week we launched some books that other people have written and other people have published, and then we did do some reprinting of the Marine Rifle Squad and scouting and patrolling military publications. But the main thing that I want to talk about in this particular episode is walk through the T.Rex Arms book list. We got off to a pretty slow start with books. 5 or 6 books is not very many. It's not an entire library, so the T.Rex Arms book list has 50 or 60 other books on it, and you probably already know this because you probably already see other T-Rex content that we have published on the newsletter, the YouTube, all those different places. But some of you like going through this stuff in a little bit more detail in an audio platform sort of scenario where you can listen to it while you drive. And some of the most listened to and most complimented and most requested pieces of T-Rex media in the past were the first iterations of this reading list, which we did back when T-Rex Talk was a live show on the main channel, and we just talked through some books. That was deeply appreciated, and that is the foundation of this T.Rex Arms reading list here. But now it is a PDF file that you can download, and you can print, and you can go through, and there's even a little space for notes here. I have some actual notes for the show written down. So, why do we have this new focus on books? It's not new, but why are we trying to get into books at T.Rex Arms? We've always been interested in inspiring, educating, and equipping. And books do all of those things in the same way that YouTube videos and podcasts and physical products can do those things. There's a huge amount of really valuable information in the books that we have chosen. And as usual, we have curated a list that it felt very long while I was writing it, but now it feels pretty short. And I've already had some fantastic additions that people have suggested that are going to make their way in here. So even though you probably already have downloaded this and you've already printed off a copy, I need to put a little version number on the top so that you can check and see if there's a new version with additional books that you haven't heard of. And some of the books that I have on the table here are not in the reading list because I'm still reading them and decide whether or not they go in here. But let's get started with the book list. Somebody asked me if we could devise a homeschool curriculum, specifically around social studies or civics. And to be perfectly honest, that's kind of what this is, more or less. It's not quite enough to be an entire K through 12 reading list necessarily, but I will say this is kind of my family's curriculum in some ways. I definitely will want my kids to have read almost all of these books by the time that they are finished with school. They will never be finished with education, but at some point they will be finished with what other people consider to be school. And at that point, they should have really made themselves very familiar with all of these books, if not read all of these books. And they've already got a pretty good head start on the children's section that we have in the back here. So this is as close to a curriculum as we will probably ever do, but we will continue to expand on it. We will continue to add stuff to the website. So the first section in here is Second Amendment books. On the podcast in the past, I have reviewed individual books pretty specifically, books that are pro-Second Amendment, firearm rights, and freedoms, like In Defense of the Second Amendment by Larry Correia. And I've also been reviewing books from the other side. So books by people like Ryan Bussey, who wrote the book Gunfight. He has positioned himself as a former member of the firearm industry because he did work as a sales guy for Kimber. Whether or not you consider Kimber to be part of the firearms industry or not is a little bit dependent on a bunch of factors. But he's an interesting guy because, as I suspected, I think I might have even predicted this, he didn't write that book just to sell copies of a book. He wrote that book to get his foot into the door of the political system. He's already working for gun control groups, but he is currently running for governor of Montana, I believe. Is it Montana? Wyoming? Wyoming. He's positioning himself as a third-party, good, old, rugged individual with a background in the firearm industry. And he's trying to cover up the fact that all of his money for the last little while, all of his employment has been done for basically Michael Bloomberg. Kind of undercuts his pitch as governor. But interesting guy. So we will continue to do book reviews on the channel. I'd love to know which books you want us to review, because I also really enjoy having conversations and interviews with people. So help me try to figure out what's going to be the most useful for you guys. But the Second Amendment section of the T.Rex Arms reading list has a whole bunch of books that cover different aspects of the Second Amendment and your right to keep and bear arms, but also the gun control movement, the crimes, the statistics, the various things that always get brought up after, say, a school shooting or some other event that gets a huge amount of news coverage, even though that it's relatively rare. So knowing some of these crime statistics, some of the different media talking points, some of the ways that the legislation has developed over time is really useful. So books like the Second Amendment Manifesto by John Payne, the Larry Correia book, and some of the more complex books like David Koppel. This is not an easy to read book necessarily. This is almost like an academic study from a proper think tank, because that is what it is. He's a lawyer who worked on some really important cases and documents those really well. But as I point out down here a little bit later, the Second Amendment does not come out of a vacuum. So even though that's going to be the place where a lot of T-Rex customers want to begin their reading, want to learn more about the Second Amendment stuff, that is their connection to T-Rex, there is a lot of backstory, and there's a huge amount of work that has been done ahead of time to understand and codify and experiment with some of the different philosophical concepts of human rights, what they are, where they come from, and what specifically are those human rights. And this right of self-defense, this right of the individual to pursue life and to be able to defend himself and defend others is something that goes back to way before gunpowder. The conversation about that particular right has been going on for some time. So we got some other books on the list here that go back. Slaying Leviathan is one that we've talked about on the show, and I still need to get Dr. Sunshine to be a guest, because he would be a fantastic interview for this podcast. But talking through the history of different governments and different, not always revolutions, sometimes reformations, sometimes recalibrations of governments as they rise and as they fall. This conversation about, is civil government limited? Do kings have a divine right to do whatever they want, or do they have limitations? It's a fantastic introduction to that. But there's a lot of books that were written in that time. This is the Magdeburg Confession that was written in the 1550s. Pastors in the town of Magdeburg wrote this book as an explanation to Charles V, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, why they were going to disobey him. And it wasn't just because we feel like it. It was, you are exceeding your authority, and disobedience to tyrants is obedience to God. It's a very important book in the development of Western civilization from that point forwards. And on here we have a bunch of other books like Vindicta Contra Tyrannus, Lex Rex. These are books that get quoted a lot by the founders. These were well read in this shift from the Middle Ages into the Reformation times. And around the Reformation, you have the Counter-Reformation, and you have the Renaissance, and you have the Enlightenment, and you have the colonization of America, and then you have the independence of the colonies. All this stuff is happening in a pretty short amount of time, just a very few centuries, from the 1500s through the end of the 1700s. A lot of stuff happens on the political landscape of the world, but a huge amount of stuff happens in the philosophical understanding of political theory of the world. So you need a little bit of backstory before you get to that. And then there's another book here, which is not on the list, but I appreciate tremendously, called Justifying Revolution. And this is a book that documents the sermons, the writings of pastors specifically, pastors who were studying and preaching on this topic in the 13 American colonies, that really gave people the foundation to resist the British government, Parliament specifically, as the rules began to change. Because remember, we have colonies that have compacts with the king. They already have a rule of law. They already have elected officials here. They already have their constitutional convention meeting. There's individual governors and sheriffs and different elected officials doing law enforcement work here in the colonies. And it is Britain that tries to change all that, and specifically Parliament. And one of the taxation without representation complaints came from the fact that our colony exists because we have a compact with the king. We don't actually have any agreement with Parliament. Parliament has no authority to make specific taxes and laws that govern people over here. That is where eventually there became this Declaration of Independence. So this book here, Justification of Revolution, The American Clergy's Argument for Political Resistance, is a really good book. It should probably be on the reading list. The only reason that it's not is it's a pretty new book, and it's from the Oxford University Press, which means that it's really expensive. So it's a fantastic book, but it is a kind of a specific book. If you want overviews, this is not that. This is a really specific drill down into what the clergy were doing, what the sermons were about. Very important for understanding what was going on, but some of it's hard reading. Those are serious sermons delivered back in those days, and then the Oxford Press prints very nice but very expensive books. Eventually, there will be secondhand ones, I'm sure, used ones that you can get for cheaper, so keep an eye out for it. Maybe I should put it on the list. Do you guys want this list to be 100 pages long of books that you decide whether or not you're interested in them, or would you like to be 12 pages of books that you just know you have to have? I'd love to know what you're thinking about this. Section 3 of the reading list is the American history that comes after all this development throughout Europe and Western civilization. And most of this is stuff that surrounds the actual history of what happened. Not quite as much of the political theory. So much of that was done before that I know that people point to Thomas Paine quite a bit as somebody who developed this, but he is more of a summarizer and a sloganeer than an actual political philosopher. And you can tell this because his political theories change based on the environment that he's in. When he goes to France after the American Revolution, all of his political thought changes. He is just summarizing what is being discussed around him. The stuff that he wrote in England before he came to America, very different than the stuff that he wrote when he was around the Puritans and the founders who lived in the colonies. So the American history section is mostly history because the bones, the foundation, a lot of that was done ahead of time. They're referring back to that stuff when they debate the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and so forth. But the history is really important, and understanding all the stuff that happened leading up to the war is vital. So Plymouth Plantation, very important book for understanding why the colonists were doing what they were doing, specifically in New England. Paul Revere's Ride is a fantastic book because it explains what was going on in the colonies prior to war actually breaking out. What needed to be in place before the people were actually ready to resist in Lexington and Concord. That's really important. In some ways, it's a discouraging book because a huge amount of work had already been done. That was really necessary for the Lexington and Concord resistance to be successful and to be the shot heard around the world, the beginning of a war that turned out with Americans actually winning their freedom and not just losing a war and then being punished for it by the tyrannical overlords that would have defeated them. And 1776 goes into a lot more detail of the war. Paul Revere's Ride, everything leading up to. And 1776 is very much focused on the military logistics. And David McCullough does a fantastic job with that book, fantastic job with a lot of other biographies. So highly, highly recommended that you read some of his stuff. Even his non-military history stuff is really interesting. His Wright brothers book is fascinating. And then I have a weird book. Some of these books are really obvious. Like 1776 is a best-selling book that you would have seen at Costco or Barnes & Noble. But we also have a bunch of weird books in here. Those are kind of my favorites, books that nobody talks about anymore. So The Origin and Principles of the American Revolution compared with The Origins and Principles of the French Revolution is a book that was written shortly after the French Revolution. It was written during the Napoleonic times. Napoleon did not like this author. His name is Friedrich von Goetz, and he describes the differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, not just in how they went down, but in what they were trying to accomplish and why. It's a fascinating book, and John Quincy Adams thought that it was so important that he is the one who translated it from German into English. I believe he may have been the German ambassador at that time. I mean, the American ambassador to Germany at that time. But he's writing about, it's basically a justification of John Adams. So he had a personal stake in getting it translated. But there's a pretty fascinating look at the differences between those two revolutions. General World History only has 3 books in it. So of all the sections that need to be beefed up, this is certainly one of them. But understanding where some stuff got started by reading about the White Horse King. We've talked about Alfred the Great. We've talked about this book that was written by Dr. Ben Merkel in previous episodes, but understanding how England got built, how the common law came into effect, how some of these nations stopped being piratical, nomadic, raiding Viking tribes, and they became actual nations with actual laws and actual civilization growing out of these things. England is the perfect one to look at because it is this island nation where you can really see this happening, not in a vacuum, but in a little bit more of a contained spot. And Alfred is a fantastic example, not just of a good leader, but just an incredible role model for leaders. And then Modern Times is another pivotal one. Paul Johnson is a great historian who writes hugely widely, everything just all across the board. But Modern Times talks about the real transition in the late 1800s and 1900s into the 20th century. There is a massive shift from the old world to the new world. People in the United States and Europe in the early 1800s would have had a great deal of understanding and a lot of continuity all the way back basically to Alfred the Great, with common law and essential understandings of what freedoms were. Even though there'd been changes here and there was a pretty common thread that would have been familiar across centuries. But there is a massive, huge sea change that happens as we go into the modern world. It is technical, it is economical, but it's also philosophical. So Modern Times covers those things. It almost cannot be overstated what a big change it was. I don't want you to just think about the mid-1800s. In the mid-1800s, the fastest you can get anywhere is on a horse, exactly as things have been since the dawn of humankind. People have never been able to go faster than horses or send messages faster than maybe homing pigeons right up until around the 1850s. Suddenly, steam is harnessed and people can actually apply more power to their work than horses or oxen have been able to do it. And this is a massive, massive change. And shortly after that comes electricity and telegraphs and messages traveling faster than horses, a thing that has not happened throughout all of human history. So much of this stuff happens so fast that it's almost incomprehensible. And just in a couple of generations, you go from nobody has traveled faster than a horse to people landing on the moon, or possibly not landing on the moon, but people putting stuff into space, people sending probes thousands of years at thousands of miles per hour throughout the solar system. We can talk about the moon landings later. But just think about the fact, in 1903, nobody has flown. In 1960s, we have people going into space, massive rockets doing incredible things, fighter jets that go faster than the speed of sound. The speed of the technological change and the economic changes on the planet are almost incomprehensible. And along with those come a huge number of philosophical changes to the way that we think about power and government and human rights and human beings. And a great book to sort of soberingly hammer that point home is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is probably the easiest book to read that Solzhenitsyn ever wrote, but it's also just hard going. It's such a grueling book to read, the way that human beings were treated in the Soviet Union. In this age of advanced technology and incredible communicative power, just the destruction of the human beings, the human individual, the human soul that was taking place in countries like the Soviet Union. It's very important to understand some of this stuff. The next section is economics, and economics is very important for understanding some of these things, especially today when economics is very poorly understood and everyone thinks that inflation is happening because Frito-Lay is charging too much for potato chips. So get yourself some economic books. Industry and technology, obviously this is one that I personally love and am fascinated by, so there are 4 books on here, even more than world history. But some of this stuff is important. I just spent a lot of time talking about the changes in technology that affect the world hugely. And some of these books make better connections than these. But I really love this first book that I mentioned here, Diary of an Early American Boy. It's very easy to look at the changes that happened in the 20th century and the 19th century and see technology bringing about massive shifts. And ultimately, things are pretty miserable in the 20th century, and sort of connect the dots there and decide that you're going to be a Luddite. Because the good old days were when we were agrarian people. You couldn't travel too fast. You couldn't travel too far. You couldn't build gigantic atomic bomb dropping aircraft. But there is a tremendous civilizing power that comes in good tools and good technology. And I love the Diary of an Early American Boy because it's really understandable. You have this family in early America. Every time they make a new tool, they get more effective. So in the course of the book, which is 1 year, they go from doing a ton of stuff by hand to they have built a water mill and they have automated so much stuff and they're so much more productive and there's so much more that they can do and they're so much more effective as a family. It's a fantastic book and beautiful illustrations from Eric Sloan. So I think this is really worth reading sort of together. Modern times showing the degradation of human beings that comes with some of the philosophical ideas, and to understand that the tools, the technology is not driving this as much as the ideas are, some of the ways that the tools are being used for good. And James Burke has a great book called Connections, which is fascinating as it talks about this piece of technology allowed this to be built, which allowed this to be built. Connecting the dots is always fun, and he does a great job at it. And if you want to see something amazing, the video series that he made for the BBC back in 1978 is incredible. Now, you have to get past the fact that he's wearing a ridiculous 1978 leisure suit for the entire thing. But he goes to big cavalry reenactments and talks about Normandy. He goes to Cape Canaveral and does stand-ups right in front of NASA rocket launches as they happen. It's all stuff that's being done on film with no technology, one take. It's unbelievably cool. And he's wearing the most ridiculous outfit that you can possibly imagine while he does the whole thing. So, yeah, check it out. I would love to be as good a communicator as he is in that show. Number 7 is business books. We find business books really interesting at T.Rex because we are a business, and most of us that are involved in running the business of T.Rex don't have a huge amount of business background. So reading through a bunch of these books while we do the actual work of running T.Rex has been really fascinating. And those of you who are interested in starting your own businesses or already doing business may have already come across all these books and have better ones. I'm not saying that this is the best business book list that anybody has ever read, but these are books that we have read, we've put their ideas into practice, and we've seen fruit come out of those here at T.Rex. And if you want to know like some of the process of like how we got to where we are, why we adopted Lean, when we did this chapter also kind of like, yeah, it's pretty transparent. There's not a gazillion business books we've read that are not on this list. It's very much what T.Rex is in here. And then we got to talk about politics a little bit. Politics is impossible to completely divorce from economics, from history. But there are books that are specifically political books. Bastiat's The Law is a classic, but P.G. O'Rourke is an author who writes about politics in America in the 80s and 90s, and he has interesting books. He's a great observer, and he's just cynical enough that he's able to cover politics properly. So I've actually talked about P.J. O'Rourke. I recorded a podcast episode shortly after he passed away a couple of years ago. So if you are specifically curious about P.J. O'Rourke, you can go and listen to that in the archive. But I recommend his books in the middle when he had matured a bit. Then later he matured more and his books got slightly less interesting. But books that are specifically about political ideas and thought, and Victor Davis Hanson has one called The Dying Citizen, which is interesting because there are ideas throughout history that oftentimes feel very overlooked. But it isn't because they're forgotten. It is because they are so well understood that people take them for granted. Firearm law, firearm freedoms are actually in this category. The Second Amendment is very clear and it's very simple, but the founders don't actually spend a huge amount of time talking about the importance of the militia or the importance of people to be able to defend themselves. It is just assumed. It is just assumed that everybody will understand that this is the case. So they mention it, and it's in more of their letters to one another. It's in more of their writings in other places, but it is assumed to be so widely understood and so beyond any form of debate that the Second Amendment is just really short and really simple. And the concept of citizenship is one of those things. So this book that talks about the concept of citizenship is something that has been widely understood. And now it's just like, well, your borders should just kind of be open. Anybody that wants to come in should just kind of be able to do whatever, but they should also be separate enough that they do get some kind of special treatment. You find yourself devolving back into something that existed before the citizen, which is the serf. This idea that the king or the state or whatever mechanism that you have for political civil power is over the people, to the point that the people aren't really a part of the state and they're not really a part of the country. They are a commodity, a human resource inside of the company or the country, as opposed to being the citizens that actually govern the country through their representatives. It is a really important distinction to make. And if you sort of take it for granted and you don't defend it as an idea, it can slip away from you. And it's happened in a bunch of countries, and it has the potential to happen faster than you think. And that brings us to philosophy and theology. So these are important topics that really go down to what is man and what are his rights and responsibilities. Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher is an important one, and this is based on a concept that Solzhenitsyn wrote about in an article by the same name. This idea that human beings have an objective truth that they need to live by, and that it's incredibly destructive to us when we live by lies. When we support lies or we refuse to speak up against lies is vital. And this idea of objective truth is something we also talk about in a couple of books. This makes a nice little trilogy, in my opinion. Francis Schaeffer wrote a book called How Should We Then Live?, which Rushdoony followed up with By What Standard? And then Greg Bahnsen followed that up with By This Standard. So those fit super nicely together, in my opinion, and talk these things through very well. Now, one of the things that somebody has asked about is, why is the Bible not on this reading list? Kind of goes back to what I just said about citizenship. I assume that anybody who's reading a reading list that suggests that you read Francis Schaeffer and R.J. Rushdoony and Greg Bahnsen will realize that the reading list has been compiled by a Christian who assumes that you already should know that you're supposed to read the Bible. But the Bible is not on this list, even though I think that it is absolutely required reading. So, maybe I shouldn't be taking that for granted so much. And these are some pretty hardcore books, theologically speaking. Now, they're short books. I don't think they're necessarily that difficult to read, but these are concepts that I don't know if I would call them rare. They're certainly rare within the bigger evangelical world of weak American churches. They're certainly not rare in the sweep of history. They're certainly not rare if you go back and look at older books from the church, but they are certainly not. They're certainly not the things that you will find in most churches in the United States right now. So definitely good books to read. Then we have the Rogues Gallery. I think it's important to keep up with what books your enemies have been writing. It's important to know some of the arguments that are being made by the other side, to understand both halves of the conversation, and to understand what are the books that have been really influential that have driven us in specific directions. So this one is a little bit controversial. I already had some people say I need to take this one out of the Rogues Gallery. Machiavelli's The Prince. This is important partly because of the timing, but also because it has been a hugely influential book. But I'm not a fan of the kind of brutal utilitarian and pragmatism that Machiavelli would like his new prince to have. He understood, he's an incredibly smart guy, he understood that we were going into a new world. There was going to be a new age. There was going to be new philosophical and political thought. So his idea of the new prince is a shift away from the old type of monarch to a more totalitarian leader. And I think that it's very important that you read this book because that's absolutely something that happened. Whether he called that change that was inevitably coming or his book was so widely read by other bureaucrats and princes and leaders that it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I can't say. But hugely influential book, worth understanding, just like the Communist Manifesto and Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. These are books that you need to read and understand. And I had a recommendation for another book to add to this list, which is the 46 Rules of Power. Or is it 47? Or is it 48? I forget. 50 Cent collaborated with the author to come up with some new rules of power, and I got mixed up on actually how many there are. But I really hate that book if that book is the way that you actually achieve power and get ahead. But I think it's a fantastic book if you want to have a documented list of things that are effective in the short term for you personally if you are selfish and destructive in every other possible way. So depending on how you read that book, it should either go here in the Rogues Gallery or, I don't know, maybe philosophical history. I really hate the rules, but I can't argue that the rules are effective for people who want to destroy. Rules for Radicals is another example of this. Saul Alinsky had some fantastic ideas for creating social change. If the social change that you want is destroying existing structures, and a lot of his ideas only work at destroying good structures. They'd be far less effective at destroying bad structures because bad structures are just built differently. Completely unrelated to destroying structures, we have counterinsurgency warfare books in the military studies area. And then I'm looking through, this is kind of my reading list. Resistance to Tyranny by Joseph Martino is another book that seems really solid, but I haven't been through it enough. It should probably go in our military studies. It is more direct insurgency warfare, not so much counterinsurgency warfare. And then Taking Power on the Origins of Third World Revolutions by John Foran. This one is from the Cambridge University Press, and it is a fascinating study of things that have happened in Tibet and other places. Third World Revolutions generally don't happen from inside in the 20th century. There's usually somebody pulling strings from the outside, and it's usually Soviet and communist interference. This is a really interesting book. I'm not sure if it is necessary reading, but it's got some fascinating stuff in there that possibly fits in this military studies section. And this military studies section is another one where we haven't got the obvious books. I mean, we do have a Steve Ambrose book, so that's kind of obvious. He's a pretty popular writer, but we're looking for kind of the outliers, the guys who would define the edges of things, the guys that would provide interesting context. So guys like David Hackworth, John Singlaub, really interesting stuff that isn't talked about much. This War and Peace encyclopedia is fascinating because it talks about the wars that really important military study lessons don't come out of. Small, brutal, ugly squabbles between countries, stuff that happened after World War II, so it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really count as war. These are things that are fascinating to study and important to know about, even though great generals don't usually come out of them. The actions that take place in these wars don't get talked about at West Point. They don't get published too many other places. They're interesting to know about, though. And that brings us very close to the end of the book, where we finish with fiction and children's books. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with fiction. Fiction is fascinating and has tremendous capabilities for teaching and helping people to understand things, but fiction also takes time. I find myself tempted to read more fiction and learn about stuff that isn't actually related to the real world, but it is so effective as a teaching tool. So the first one that we have on here is Robinson Crusoe, which is also one of the first novels in the English language. And Robinson Crusoe is a fascinating book. Something that should be on here is Swiss Family Robinson. Swiss Family Robinson is like the kids' version of Robinson Crusoe, and it was originally written by a Swiss author for his kids. And there's ways in which it's kind of a silly book. Like, they land on this deserted island, and literally every animal on the face of the earth appears to live on this deserted island, which is impossible. People have also criticized the fact that the father knows how to make use of every plant and animal on the island, which they argue is also impossible. Until you remember that the author who wrote the book did actually know all of this stuff himself, and he literally wrote the book as an educational tool for his kids so that they would know the same things. They would know how to skin and make the best use of kangaroo hide, and also do this with puffin eggs, and also do this with water wheels, and also do this. It was an instruction manual for his kids that was turned into an interesting story. It's a great use of fiction, and it's a way better book than a lot of people remember it to be. But fiction's also a great place to explore certain ideas. It's part of the reason that people should read Animal Farm in 1984 and some of the dystopian novels that allow people to play out into extremes some of the ideas. If this idea is pursued to its logical conclusion, this is where you might end up. And we've talked a little bit about totalitarian literature in previous episodes. What's the name of that one that we did? It's the creepiest, the strangest, the creepiest dystopian book you've never heard of. We talked a little bit about the kind of the beginnings of dystopian fiction and the lessons that those things have taught in the past. Good lessons and bad. Fiction is a fantastic place to do character studies. There are fantastic, heroic people throughout history and horrible villains that make for great writing, and it's important to learn from their lives. But they also are people that are hard to write about it sometimes. Nobody is perfectly heroic or perfectly villainous. It is easier to be perfectly villainous than perfectly heroic. But you also don't want to put words in people's mouths and describe them in ways that is untruthful when you're pulling lessons out of their lives. So I think there is a lot of value in creating fictional characters to demonstrate some of these things. You can do that in a way that is, ironically enough, more truthful than taking somebody who had an actual 80 years on the planet of opinions and actions and words and distilling him down into a book and trying to figure out how you're going to depict him. So I think that is incredibly valuable. That's one of my favorite parts of Lord of the Rings, is that there are many different kinds of people in this book. And the other thing that's fascinating, I think, is that everybody in that book kind of has a double. There are twins. There's an example of the good version of this and the bad version of this. And I would say that Tolkien does a phenomenal job of that without hitting you over the head with it. There's a lot of subtlety. There's a lot of nuance. But that's one of, I think, the great things about Lord of the Rings. Obviously, it's this great epic and incredibly influential fantasy novel that just changed the way that people thought about fantasy ever afterwards. But the world building is cool, but the world that Tolkien describes is cooler even than the world building and the fanciful elements. And the characters that inhabit that world and take on the responsibilities that they do so in a way that I think is super instructive and really deep. And it comes from, I believe, two things. Number one, Tolkien's faith and his understanding of Christian doctrine and theology, and also his understanding of history. The fact that he understood so much of human history and had read so much of the writings of previous generations and even nations that weren't even around anymore, and the reading their source documents in their own languages, I think gave him a tremendous depth as he writes about this stuff. And when fiction is done this way by people who actually understand a topic or understand an aspect of character or understand an idea and really want to explore it in a world that doesn't just make, for example, just a topical example from Twitter, Churchill, the greatest hero who has ever lived, and Adolf Hitler, the worst possible villain that has ever walked the face of the planet. If we want to do something that doesn't just marvelize or Disneyfy real, actual human beings, fictional characters are a good way to do this. And Lord of the Rings is obviously a hard act to follow. C.S. Lewis does a good job of this with some books like The Screwtape Letters is a great examination of human character, the Space Trilogy, and then, of course, the Narnia books. They're not really on here, but, C.S. Lewis is on here. And that brings us to children's books. I've given this a huge amount of thought because Heidi and I have 5 kids now, and a number of them are reading, and all of them are getting read to. But we've also had a ton of requests from people asking about children's books, which I'm really pleased by because children's books today, modern children's books, are pretty bad. The rate at which old books disappear is concerning, but the rate at which good old children's books disappear is even more concerning. There's a huge amount of focus on getting rid of bad ideas in kids' books because kids are so impressionable. And there's always this desire to be pumping out brand new children's books. And new children's books, I can't tell you how much I hate the trends in children's publishing right now. Like even just the styles of the art, I think are bad for kids, like just cognitive development of kids. Also, ugly, just bad art. So, old children's books, back when people appreciated art and they wanted to, they had better lessons that they wanted kids to take away from the books. These are better books. And I want my children to read books and to listen to books that give them some understanding of reality. So, you will see on this list, there's a whole bunch of pilgrim type books. There's a whole bunch of frontier and homesteading books where life is just pretty brutal. You have your Little House on the Prairies, of course. You have your Little Britches, of course. You have a whole bunch of other books that have little in the title. But a lot of these books, they don't have death in them the way that like Caldecott Award winners always have death in them, where there's a focus on mortality. No, these are just books about reality, and people just die in these books because that is what late 19th century America was like out on the frontier. And these books disappear oftentimes because they have Indians in them. And the way that we talk about Native Americans nowadays means that we can't read any of the old books. But there are some fascinating books like Two Little Savages that are all about fieldcraft and woodcraft and wood lore and Indian skills. And they're kind of verboten now simply because they use the wrong word instead of saying Native American. But they're actually pulling out all of the things that are praiseworthy from different specific tribes. Two Little Savages is a good example of this. And I want my kids to have an understanding of this. And I want my kids to be reading books that were written by people who were there. Ernest Thompson Seton is the one who wrote that book. He had a fascinating life as a naturalist and as an explorer with these actual Indian tribes. And the generation before him were the actual Indian fighters and Indian scouts. And he had relationships with these people. So those are the kind of books that I want my kids to write. As close as possible to the actual historical events, not filtered through a huge amount of just rethinking and re-examining and revisioning of stuff that happened in the past. So Two Little Savages, I mean, the name in and of itself, you can probably understand why it's not at your local library anymore, but it is actually, I would say, a book that is extremely flattering may not be the right word, extremely honoring to a number of things about Native American tribes that were honorable, and talks a little bit about the other side too. And it explains in pretty good detail why two boys out camping in the woods in the 1800s would want to learn Indian skills and live in a teepee and do Indian stuff. So it's a good book for kids to read or, have read to them. A lot of these books, I will admit, when I read them to my kids, I do a little bit of editing. But usually what I'm editing out is boring parts, not objectionable parts. The objectionable parts are actually things that we talk about more. It's the boring parts that we talk about less. So that is the T.Rex Arms book list. I didn't go through every single book because you can go to the website trex-arms.com and download the book list, and it will continue to grow. And as you guys suggested, we're going to continue to put stuff in there. And I've had a bunch of great recommendations already. Now, as I've said, we've been printing some military field manuals ourselves, just so that we can guarantee the quality, and also it's a good opportunity to fix a couple of different things that are in some of these things. Mostly bad fonts and bad pictures. We can increase the quality and add a few little features here and there. A lot of folks have asked for more specific technical manuals on things like survival, water purification, food, stuff like that. But I want to know from you guys what some of the other categories are besides military field manuals and logistics. I also had a really interesting request from somebody who said we should start a T.Rex Arms book club. And I love the idea of a book club, but I don't so much love the idea of an internet book club. That sounds a little bit like a podcast with extra steps. We're already kind of doing a podcast. It could be a good live stream, but the best part about a book club is the back and forth between the different people talking about the stuff as a group. So I will tell you that I 100% heartily endorse the idea of a T.Rex Arms book club, or dozens or hundreds of T.Rex Arms book clubs. You guys should get out and start putting those together. Those are things that you need to do with people face to face. And, yeah, a lot of the different things in here are, I think, great things to discuss. Many of these books are nothing if not cans of worms. And the best things that you could probably do in an election season is get together in a local coffee shop with half a dozen guys and gals and start reading through, say, the Magdeburg Confession, while the TV in the corner has Kamala Harris interviews on it. I think that would be a fantastic juxtaposition and good for all parties involved. So I think the book club is a fantastic idea, but it's not something that we can do for you. This is a thing that you have to do. Now, to be honest, we do have kind of book clubs. Michael McMartin, who was on the podcast half a dozen episodes, 24 episodes ago, something like that, talked about the pub club that we've been running here at T-Rex. And we actually went through this particular Marine reference publication on rifle squads. And we went through the scouting and patrolling one a little bit faster, but we spent an hour every week on a chapter of this book. And it was a fantastic book club experience because Michael McMartin is a Marine who has taught this stuff and done this stuff. But even if we were talking through this stuff without the benefit of his oversight and tutelage, still would have been a really helpful thing for us to do together as a group. So you've got to get a group of your own and pick some of these books and go through these. And I have really enjoyed the feedback that I've gotten from you guys, not just on the book list. It's been up since Wednesday, not just on the field manuals, but the comments that a bunch of you gave us a couple years ago when we first started talking about books on the podcast, when it was a live stream, the continual interaction that we've had largely over email. So I'm excited that the podcast is back on YouTube now. If you're listening on Spotify, you can add comments somehow, and we do see those. But if you're listening on YouTube, it's a little easier to add the comments. It's a little bit easier for us to reply, and more people can interact. So that's cool. I know that I've been very critical of YouTube comments and commenters in the past, and I will continue to be. But at the same time, I do appreciate those who are pitching in with ideas, thoughts, and conversations. Not as good as having them in person, but it is better than nothing. So we will continue to talk about books. We'll continue to add stuff to the book list, and we're continuing to add books to the T.Rex Arms store, and we're going to continue to find books that are worth printing. And I'm always on the lookout for stuff that is maybe a little bit less well known. Here's a quick example just to close. The Armax Journal of Contemporary Arms is a magazine. It's a very nice, well-bound magazine, but this is a proper academic journal specifically for the study of contemporary arms. Now, some of them are a little bit more historical than others, but a lot of them are fairly recent. So here is a several-page article describing exactly how it was that the New Zealand Defence Force modernized its rifles, moving from the Steyr AUG to the M4. I mean, this is all the sort of stuff that you would expect to find on the Forgotten Weapons YouTube channel, but in a little bit more detail with graphs and with pictures, with a lot more footnotes from a number of different authors. If this is interesting to you, then this is a fantastic journal to be subscribed to. I think that it is 2 of these a year, so it's kind of expensive, but it's not like it's a monthly journal. The other reason that I like this is, and I want to support it by being a subscriber, is this is the kind of academic study that weapons deserve. Getting back to technology for a second. Weapons and firearms, the last 500 years, are a core human technology. They are inexorably linked to our civilization and our economics and our manufacturing capability. And weapons should be studied in this kind of serious academic way, in the same way that cars or airplanes or other things that human beings have created should be. And just because firearms are politically unpopular right now in most of the world, in the United States a little bit, doesn't mean that we should stop doing this kind of intense, rigorous study. So I'm not that guy. I can't do that kind of study, but Ian McCollum is doing a fantastic job, and the people who are publishing stuff in the RMAX journal are doing a fantastic job. So just another example of something that you probably wouldn't see talked about in too many places, but I'm really glad that it exists. And if it's the sort of thing that's interesting to you, then maybe I'm the first one to tell you about it. So that'll be fun. So thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I'm looking forwards to getting more feedback from you guys. A lot of you have written into our customer service line, team@trex-arms.com, with book recommendations, with ideas over the years, and a lot of your work is in this particular book list. It's either stuff that you've suggested, or it's kind of started a little bit of a thought process, and a new section has been added. So we'll continue to develop this and continue to work on some other stuff. But here's your homework assignment. It's been a long time since I've given a homework assignment in a podcast episode, but the homework assignment is start reading a book. It doesn't have to be one of the books that's on the reading list, but if you don't have anywhere else to start, I think it's got 50 or 60 things on there. One of them is bound to interest you. And then find some other people to talk to about the book. It doesn't necessarily have to be an entire book club of people who you've all convinced to read the same book. It could just be having a conversation with a person with a chapter of a book that you read this week. Shouldn't be too hard.